This is an ABC podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Health Report with me, Norman Swan. This is a podcast extra for all you loyal subscribers to the programme. And the subject is something vitally important to us all, the future of medical research in Australia. As degenerative diseases, obesity and other chronic conditions rise, what solutions can research offer? Developing the next vaccine or cancer treatment will take ingenuity and innovation, but it's also about how we choose to structure our research approach and how it's funded. In this panel discussion recorded at the Association of Australian Medical Research Institutes, some of the country's brightest research minds share their thoughts on what the next 25 years will bring. We're coming to you from the Association of Australian Medical Research Institutes, and the topic for discussion is the future of health research over the next 20 or 25 years, but I might not follow that just to the letter. But let me introduce our panel to you. We've got Professor John Shine, who's Professor of the Australian Academy of Science, former Executive Director of the Garvan Institute, and one of the few people actually to have commercialised a product from Australian research. Professor Kathy North, who's Director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute and Professor of Child Health Research at the University of Melbourne, a paediatric neurologist, neurogeneticist, interested in genomics and on an international plane. Glynis Beecham, who's Secretary of the Department of Health and has been so for just over a year, comes with an illustrious career in public service and is a breath of fresh air, I think, in the Department of Health. Charlie Day, who's Chief Executive Officer of the Office of Innovation and Science Australia. Just what is that? You're about to find out. And last but not least, Ian Fraser, who's President of the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, former Australian of the Year, co-inventor of the hepatitis C, of the human papillomavirus vaccine. God, hepatitis B vaccine would be good. Have you got one coming up there? I think that would be excellent. Please welcome our panellists. So, John Shine, what's the purpose of medical research?
Well, to add enormous value, both socially as far as extending the quality of life, especially as we go through the ageing process. So a big contribution to society, Norman, in that sense, but also economically to provide, especially going forward now, sort of smart, idea-driven, innovation-driven technologies and businesses, which is really the future of the country, as we all know. We can't just dig it out of the ground so much anymore.
That sounds great. Charlie, does it achieve it?
At the moment, or historically, we haven't achieved it as well as we could and as well as we should. But I think there are some encouraging signs that our system as a whole is improving at translating as biomedical research. So we've seen in recent years examples like venetoclax and moxidectin as therapies that have come through the development process and are making a real difference in people's lives. So I don't think we're there yet. We've got a long way yet to go, but it's better than it was a decade ago.
Right. Tell us about your office and what it does.
So Innovation and Science Australia was established about 2.5 years ago as part of the then Turnbull government's innovation statement, what's known as the ideas boom, colloquially. And it was really established, I think, out of a view that the innovation system could benefit from longer-term strategic advice, which is independent of government and takes a whole-of-government perspective. So if you look across the way the federal government supports innovation, there's investment in health, there's investment in industry, there's investment in defence, in agriculture and other places, and there's a desire to have a joined-up view of that. So Innovation Science Australia is a board of innovation practitioners who provide advice to the federal government to improve the functioning of that system.
So, Kathy, are we achieving these goals that John Shine set for ourselves?
I would add an additional goal I agree that we need to be pushing innovation, but I think at a grassroots level we're really aiming to improve patient health. And I do think we achieve that incredibly well. We take problems as they arise and address them. And that's looking at, if you look at the major innovations in terms of infectious disease, immunisation and prevention, but then you look at how we start to harness new technologies like genomics, and then we look at disease mechanism and developing of novel therapies. There is an end point where commercialisation and innovation is an incredibly important part of that, but I think the application into healthcare is something that we are readily achieving on a day-to-day basis and doing quite well.
So, Ian Fraser, if we're the one thing I missed out in terms of your CV is that you're involved with the Medical Research Futures Fund. Why do we need such a potentially $20 billion fund when we've been giving the National Health and Medical Research Council hundreds of millions of dollars each year? Is that not a sort of sign of failure?
No, I don't think so. I think that we recognise that there are a lot of good research is investigator-driven through the National Health and Medical Research Council, but also a lot of research is research which can be commissioned, if you like, to help delivering healthcare properly. And quite a lot of that, it's better if there's an agenda set by somebody other than the researchers doing the work. We recognise that there are, if you like, holes in the system. We build capacity through training researchers to do what they like to do. And of course, that's what they want to do then once you've trained them. But we also have to then tackle the bigger problems which are outside of the experience at the moment. Public health, for example, gets underdone in the system. There's funds within the NHMRC for public health research, but in reality it's a very small part of the public health research budget that we would like to see spent, and the MRFF can commission work in public health research, health services research, that may not be part of the agenda of the individuals who might otherwise do the work.
So the listeners probably haven't heard about the MRFF. You better just explain what it is and what it seeks to do.
It's a lot of money, that's for a start.
Well, you hope it's a lot of money. The opposition hasn't committed to it if they get to government, have they?
Well, it has $9 billion in a fund at the moment. It plans to be $20 billion. The interest off that money will be available in perpetuity to fund health and medical research. There are a set of priorities for research. There is a strategy behind the priorities. And there are a number of missions and other funding vehicles, most of which are open and contestable, some of which are contestable but in specific purposes. A large part of it is also involved in beefing up particularly our ability to do translational research, clinical trials, and training the next generation of clinical researchers.
So, Glynis, as the Secretary of the Department of Health, you getting value for money?
The Medical Research Future Fund has been going for 2 to 3 years. We've got the NHMRC, which has been going for 80 years. I think already we're seeing the focus, particularly on the 3 big missions, brain cancer, genomics and the Million Minds, as absolutely fantastic work that started to commence. But also when you look at the MRFF, looking at patients, clinicians, researchers and those missions, I think it's a great complement to the NHMRC and certainly the other investments being made in medical research across government. So I think it's early days. I think there's a great opportunity going forward. I love the idea that we've been able to find efficiencies in our $100 billion a year business in health and set money aside, which is legislated. There's a process around the priorities. So I think having that within the health system to make sure the health system is fit for purpose for the future and it does actually add value to patient outcomes in the future and our health and well-being is a great opportunity.
So as the Secretary of the Department, where do you want health research through the MRFF or through the NHMRC or whatever, through philanthropy, which we haven't talked about, where do you want it to have taken us?
In 5 to 10 years, when you look at the pace of change around research, technology, data and digital, I think we've got to keep up with what's coming over the hill. For me, in terms of observations, and as you mentioned, it's only a little over 12 months, it's a very fragmented system. So I think we need an absolute united purpose around where is the best value for money. And we talk about public health, population policy, there's probably bigger bangs for the buck around population policy than there is precision medicine. Childhood obesity is probably one of them. I think when you look at chronic conditions and people presenting with chronic conditions, 1 in 4 Australians, when you're over 65, 3 in 5. So I think technology and research will help us manage much better those chronic conditions going forward. I think we talk about life expectancy, but the AHW talks about also 11 years of our life expectancy we're unwell. So what can we do to ensure people stay well? And I think that's what I'd be saying to the consumer in the street.
John Shine, it doesn't sound like the research agenda of very many of our research institutes.
Oh, I think that's a bit unkind, Norman.
You're here to defend it.
The research agenda of the institutes is very much aligned with that. I mean, population health is, of course, incredibly important, but populations are made up of individuals, and so, it's all part of the same spectrum. I mean, I just couldn't agree more with what Glenn has said, though, about technology. I think if we look in the next 5, 10 years, 15, 25 years, as in the past 5, 10, 15, the research is being very much technology driven, and technology is increasing exponentially. You look forward now, we're going to have to deal with especially big data, how to handle that, artificial intelligence, machine learning. You put all that together with genomics and biocompatible materials and stem cells. There's a lot of technology that's going to play out at a population level eventually, but individually in many cases.
Ian, you were the founder of the Translational Research Institute in Brisbane, which was aimed at bringing the research findings that everybody's talking about here to market, if you like, whether that be technology to improve healthcare or indeed products. But what we're finding now is that when you do this work in the laboratory, you find a new molecule to help cancer, it's being sold back to us at unaffordable sums. Have we been sold a pup? Even when we actually manage to translate the lab to product, the pharmaceutical industry is selling us it back at unaffordable amounts.
I guess that it depends what you regard as unaffordable, but
Well, $100,000 a year for a cancer drug that improves life expectancy by 2 months sounds unaffordable to me.
And probably to me as well. But the reality, of course, is that we have adopted a model for developing new drugs, which relies very heavily on industry taking the hard load in terms of demonstrating efficacy, and created a system which is pretty much risk-averse, so that we have a very long gestation period for these new drugs before they get out there. We're going to probably have to change the model that we use for translating new molecules and new means of treatment into a research-based clinical practice program.
And what would that look like?
Well, first demonstrate safety, because that will always be the highest priority for whoever's going to use the product. But once you've got past that stage, you're going to have evolutionary trials, start off and see if it looks like it's worked in a particular way, combine it with other drugs if need be. We're going to have a health system that actually embeds research in everything that we do. And so it becomes an integral part of the development of new products, that every patient is basically part of some sort of clinical trial, because we're going to have to make the health system more efficient if we're going to get the benefit out of all this new technology that's coming along, and which is going to certainly bump the costs up if we don't.
So we'll come back to the economic aspects of this, but we've just seen an enormous fuss made of My Health Record, shaken public trust in data systems. Are we going to be able to achieve all this and bring the public along with us?
I think the lesson to be learnt from the negative press around My Health Record is that we all, as a research community and in partnership with government, need to be very much on the front foot when it comes to community engagement. And, whether it's My Health Record, big data, or in the area of genomic data, the elements of privacy and the patient owning and having control over their own data is incredibly important. So I think, and particularly going forward in new areas such as genomics or the sharing of big data, public engagement first and foremost, so that we're talking more about the benefits while we're managing the risks at multiple levels, so that people can feel secure about the access to and the use of their data. I think we also need to put it into the context. If we're going to change the healthcare system to make it more cost effective, we have to change our focus, so we're not waiting for diseases to occur and then treating them. We're taking a much more cost effective approach, which is about prevention, early intervention and early identification. And so whether it's around a rare genetic disorder or a common disorder that has genetic and environmental inputs, then we're going to need to be able to use big data from millions of individuals to make an accurate prediction for an individual, which is the basis of this.
Do you think you're going to be allowed to use that data in that way?
I think that with patient consent and probably a dynamic...
You can't get consent from 24 million Australians for their data about what they buy in Woolworths.
Well, then we also see that on Facebook and social media, there's a lot of information that people put out there that is used without their permission. But when it comes to your health data or your genomic data, we really need to be very cognizant of the wishes of the individual and use the digital technologies to have a dynamic consent platform so that people are engaged with what is happening, because it's going to be very different from now to 10 years' time.
So you've gone through this blowtorch of My Health Record, Glynis.
It's been quite an exciting process, a rocky road, and it's interesting. it has been a learning journey, and I think now we've got a secondary use framework which will require consent in terms of using the records, health records of My Health Record. So on the 11th of May, the Minister put out a secondary use framework for researchers. The first wave of research available, or data that will be available, won't be until 2020. So there is a very good framework there. We learnt from the UK model in having to put out that secondary use framework, so you could see it wasn't available for commercial purposes. It wasn't going to be privatised. It was actually going to be used for public health research. So I think, yes, it has been an interesting period of time, but now I think in terms of the research community, not only good for patients and clinicians, but a fantastic asset that will be the envy, I think, of the world.
You're listening to the Health Report here on RN with me, Norman Swan. We're coming to you from the annual conference of the Association of Australian Medical Research Institutes, and on our panel is Glynis Beecham, who's Secretary of the Department of Health, Ian Fraser, who is from the Australian Academy of Health and Medical Sciences, Kathy North, who is Director of the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, John Shine from the Australian Academy of Science, and Charlie Day from the Office of Innovation. Charlie Day, just when you're considering those settings that you talked about earlier with innovation, I just wanted to get an idea of how much you actually take into account the environment. So the environment at the moment is we're overproducing doctors. We are moving towards telemedicine, convenience medicine, virtual consultations. We have this fanciful idea about how we're going to change the world with health and medical research, and yet the fundamentals of how we deliver clinical care could change dramatically under our feet with not a shred of research.
Yeah, so I certainly think you're correct that the way that clinical care is delivered is going to change dramatically. I don't think it'll be done without research, because I think happily, the health system is well managed and well regulated, and I don't think that non-evidence-based care is going to suddenly
it might not be non-evidence-based care, but it'll be delivered in a different way, which will require very different kinds of professionals.
Yeah, and certainly when we think about the future and we think about the future of our innovation system, we fully expect that those transitions are going to happen in healthcare, as it happens in education, as it happens in all sorts of other parts of the economy. If you ask people, quite rationally, would you rather have your CT scan reviewed by a human being or a machine, knowing that the machine has a much higher accuracy rate than the human being? Most people go for the machine. But do you want a machine to tell you what that diagnosis is and how to handle that and what the implications of that are? I think people still go for the human. So I think what we will see over time is certainly the mix of roles in the healthcare system will change, but I think that the human interaction component of healthcare is going to be very durable.
John Shine, how deep can this involvement of research go? I mean, 60% or more of cancer care now is in the private sector. We haven't got a clue what's happening there, not a clue. If you look at private radiotherapy, it looks as though you're getting far too much radiation in the private sector because we pay them by fraction. It's quite likely we're getting too many courses of chemotherapy. Unless you're in a good private centre, you're probably getting less multidisciplinary team-based care. So here we're constructing all these fancy new drugs, all this new great treatment and treatment modalities, and the way we're delivering it is crap. So what's the role of research in improving the delivery?
Well, I think research gives you a good evidence base that shows what does or doesn't work, Norman, and hopefully communication and education that gets through to delivery.
I'm on your side on that one.
It's an evolution. You're not going to jump suddenly from one to the other.
But the market gets in the way of you actually delivering the care in the way it needs to be delivered. Something that Ian knows only too well. If you've got 60% of cancer care occurring in the private sector and you really haven't got much of a clue what's going on, you could have all the best drugs in the world, but you're not necessarily getting the best results.
Private sector is outside of the normal research mode, but there are some private sector institutions that do research extremely well. What you're really implying is that we actually don't monitor how we deliver any sort of care at the level of detail that would be required to change things. We need the evidence base to do that. And of course, that's exactly what clinical research should be doing routinely in public and private practice, wherever healthcare is delivered. And that's why we need an electronic health record and why we need to make it intersect with the things that we're actually doing. So we've got to educate a lot of people in this. And actually, if that's fundamentally what's at the bottom of it, is we have to educate the general population about what the health system is about and how to use it effectively and what they can expect to get out of it. And we don't do that. We have, you buy a nice car, it comes with a manual as to how to use it. You may not read the manual, but it is at least there. You buy a health system, we don't provide a manual as to how to use it. People find out the hard way by trial and error.
So let's move forward 5-10 years. And let's take disease groups, cardiovascular, cancer, dementia, degenerative diseases. What's going to have been solved by then? John, have you got a sense of that?
Obviously, there'll be a continuum of improvements in therapy and prevention especially. Within those particular disease groups, it'll vary a lot. I mean, cardiovascular, you mentioned. We know that atherosclerosis and a lot of treatments and prevention there is doing very well. Heart failure is not doing so well. So the emphasis will be more on trying to develop things for heart failure. Different cancers are responding in some of the treatments we have at present well, especially as we get to know treatments for certain cancers. As we understand their molecular mechanism better, we realise we can use that on a different type of cancer, so you can reuse existing treatments. As we get more precision medicine in cancer, understanding the different spectra of genes that drive different tumours, it will become a lot more personalised, which is fine. Some will be easier than others. I mean, Alzheimer's dementia is a real challenge. That's obviously going to become more and more of a priority as the population ages. There's a lot of promising stuff happening out there. But again, I'm sure we'll find as we get in there that you need to have more and more subtypes and stratified types of treatment and prevention. And that's the big advantage, a lot of the data that we'll be collecting from the things we've been talking about, the health records.
Kathy?
When you talk about a 5 to 10 year time frame, and you've talked about a whole series of adult disorders that have gene and environmental contributors, you need to look in that time frame for where the short-term wins are going to be. And I think we can see from experience that that needs to be done with a combination of medical therapies but also government policies. So successes in terms of decreasing the rates of smoking. We're going to need to take the same approaches to solve obesity. We're going to need to actually change the way we market high sugar drinks and the sort of things that are really contributing to the obesity epidemic. From a scientific perspective, I'm actually quite confident in the next 5 or 10 years that we'll be well along the way to eliminate food allergy as a public health issue, because we now know where the causes are of that and are starting to develop some very effective therapies as well. As the head of a child health research institute,
Which does food allergy research, yes.
Yeah, well, I wasn't going to go into allergy, but we really have the eye on the long game, and that a lot of our strategies are very much focused on what we can put in place in terms of prevention for these major epidemics that are appearing in adulthood. So the basis for obesity, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, mental health issues and allergy are all arising in childhood. And so much of our research now is about identifying the genetic and environmental risk factors, and also just starting to use community-based interventions to prevent that. And that has a great economic argument behind it as well.
But in your bailiwick as well, the wicked problem, of course, is mental health. No matter how much money we seem to throw at it, it seems to be resistant to be on a track to improvement. And yet most mental health disorders happen in adolescence. We don't seem to be looking at that too much.
We certainly are. When we've got 1 in 4 children and adolescents is suffering from anxiety and depression, the increased rates of eating disorders, for example. So again, we have to look longitudinally over a population base. For example, the childhood temperament study is now running over 3 generations to identify the risk factors and the interventions.
Cohort of 2,000 babies born in Victoria that have been following for 20 years now.
Yes. So it is a wicked problem, but I think we're increasingly realising that the interventions have to happen at a childhood level into adolescence, and again, not waiting till these problems occur, because they are very resistant to therapies.
Ian Fraser, what's the investment that needs to be made in the research enterprise to capitalise on what we're finding both at the lab and epidemiologists are finding and others? What investment is missing at a structural level?
I think that one part of it is definitely that we need to invest in training all of our healthcare practitioners about research, because we don't do that at the moment. We fail in medical school, we fail in nursing school to teach the elements of clinical research adequately to the vast majority of people who are going through the system. We've squeezed the medical system to produce a more efficient means of training healthcare practitioners, shorter courses, more focused on the very wide range of practical things that they have to do as healthcare professionals. Somewhere along the way, the research fell out. And then when you get into the hospital system, research has been driven out by the funding model. And I think that we have to drive it back in again through the funding model.
But don't we still have perverse incentives within the research enterprise itself? You've got to be first to publish. It's highly competitive and it kind of mitigates against collaboration. You've heard the story before.
Well, again, that's where the Medical Research Future Fund will enforce collaboration. The financial lever works. And we do have to recognise, I mean, what's really changed over the course of the last 20, 30 years is that we've moved from individual researchers being able to master all the technologies they need to do a particular research programme towards having to bring in experts in a whole range of different areas to get the work done. It doesn't matter whether you're talking public health or the basic biomedical research, you need a complete set of skills. And if the researchers who fail to recognise that will not be competitive for funding in the future, that's basically going to be the driver that will make change. We will have to remind them about that, but they will realise it pretty quickly when they don't get their grants.
Charlie Day, the public would hope that from innovation one gets products, whether that's better care systems, better drugs, better devices and so on. Yet when I speak to researchers, they still tell me there are enormous barriers to actually getting their ideas into practice, or even just to get to the next stage of development. Do we actually need innovation in health research, or do we need innovation in finance in Australia?
Look, I think we need innovation all the way along the value chain, if you like. The exciting thing in innovation in healthcare in Australia...
We've got pretty boring capitalists in Australia who don't like taking risks.
Well, that was certainly true, I think, 5 or 10 years ago, but in the last 5 years...
I'm still hearing this story from researchers now. The valley of death still occurs.
We've seen inflows of money into venture capital go from about $200 or $300 million a year up to over $1 billion a year in the last 5 years. We're still a long way behind global sort of leadership, global leaders, but we've got a lot more venture capital there than we've ever had before, such that I think now we really need to make sure that we've got good investable deal flow coming through from our healthcare system. But, you know, the environment for commercialisation is as good as it's been in the 15 years that I've been in the space, which, as I say, is not to say that it's good enough and it needs to be better, but there's certainly more money than there has been for a while.
John?
I mean, I agree with that, but while there's certainly more money there, I think we've still got some way to go in, it's almost culturally. We have to understand what high risk and the time frames that are involved in
That's my point.
In development in medicine. Australians they'll take a lot of risks on 2 flies climbing up a wall or something, but they want an instant response, an instant result. And we're still coming to grips with how do we deal with this long time frame. I know as an example...
And investors who want their investment de-risked before they start.
Yeah, before they even start. But, you know, sometimes we forget just how expensive it is. If I could just give you one quick example from the CSL experience, one of CSL's first genetically engineered new high-tech drugs, a long-acting factor 9 for treatment of haemophilia. Very simple genetically engineered experiment. You just add albumin to the actual factor 9 gene genetically, very simple. It took CSL about 10 years and $500 million to go from that simple early experiment to get it on the market. You just need that staying power, and we still have a long way to go to get that. You can get a bit of venture capital to begin with, but then, you know, how do you maintain that over time? And the systems aren't quite there, I think, in this country yet.
Fortunately, we have CSL, but unfortunately, CSL is an outlier in that it is prepared to invest in that long-term R&D.
They've got their own money, yeah.
And our business community more broadly is not investing at that same rate.
So, Kathy, we've got these visions which are great, personalised medicine, when it eventually bears fruit in large scale rather than small scale, where we're actually treating many cancers better than we are, reducing coronary heart disease and heart failure. We find solutions socially and economically to childhood obesity. We've got all this stuff there. What's the kind of the structural investment that needs to occur in people and systems is going to make that happen rather than just discoveries flapping in the breeze?
I think you referred to what are the perverse incentives in research, which is seeing publication as a major output or attracting more research money. And I think just in the last year or two, there's been a major change, particularly with the NHMRC, which I think will flow through to the MRFF, is the focus now and the driver for researchers is looking at the impact that your research makes. And that's how track records being judged. That is really the basis for how funding is being considered to be allocated. So it's driving team science, getting multidisciplinary research groups together, but then first and foremost, what is the significance of that work and what is the impact on human health? So I think they're really great drivers that are now built into our research system that are going to drive that change going forward.
Could you please join me in thanking our panel?
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.